Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm a big admirer of the work that is done here at OPR, so it's great to have the opportunity to talk about some of the work that my colleagues and I have done in an area that we call structural stigma and how that affects health inequalities. As some of you may know, the Institute of Medicine released a report in 2011 documenting large sexual orientation and gender identity-related health disparities. And LGBT populations are among the highest risk group, and in some cases the highest risk group for a variety of different adverse mental and physical health outcomes. Stigma has been one of the most frequently hypothesized risk factors to explain these health disparities. There are a variety of different definitions of stigma and conceptualizations of stigma in the literature. So I just want to briefly walk through the definition that I use in my own work. It is one of the most influential in the field that was put forward by my colleagues Bruce Link and Joe Phelan. And they argue that stigma involves the co-occurrence of several different overlapping components, all of which must be present for stigmatization to occur. The first is distinguishing and labeling group differences. So, of course, there are myriad group differences that societies could select, but only a subset of these group differences are selected and marked as socially salient. And so therefore stigma is inherently a social process because it involves the social selection of some group differences but not others. These group differences are then associated with negative attributes, a process known as stereotyping. And this then facilitates the idea that these groups are fundamentally different and therefore should be set apart. So once these group differences have been labeled, associated with negative characteristics and set apart, a rationale develops for status loss and discrimination at both the individual and structural levels. And finally, all of these different components must unfold within the context of power, social power, political power, economic power, in order for stigmatization to occur. So stigma has been conceptualized in literature as a multi-level construct, ranging from individual up to structural levels. Individual forms of stigma refer to the psychological processes through which stigmatized individuals both perceive and react to stigma. There are a variety of different individual forms of stigma that have been examined in the literature. Just two examples. One is concealment, that is, some stigmatized identities can be concealed, whereas others are visible. Another individual level process that's been examined is self-stigma, and that refers to the internalization of negative societal attitudes about your group. In contrast, interpersonal forms of stigma refer to interactional processes that occur between the stigmatized and the non-stigmatized. These can include really overt events like bias-based hate crimes, but they can also refer to more subtle interactional processes like microaggressions. And the vast majority of research on stigma has really focused at these two levels of analysis in the fields of psychology and medical sociology, for example. And that work has been really essential because it's documented many of the ways in which stigma operates to the disadvantage of those who are targeted by it. But at the same time, this literature has been criticized for overlooking broader structural forms of stigma, which we've defined as societal level conditions, cultural norms, and institutional policies and practices that affect the lives of the stigmatized. In terms of early conceptualizations and operationalizations of this term or concept of structural stigma, in their influential paper, Conceptualizing Stigma, Bruce Link and Joe Phelan were among the first to introduce this idea of structural stigma. And to develop it, they drew on conceptually similar frameworks, such as institutional racism. But they expanded that concept to include other stigmatized groups that have also experienced a historical legacy of social disadvantage. So after the initial use of this term, several researchers began to develop potential operationalizations of structural stigma. That is, how do we measure it and therefore study it? And Pat Corrigan and his colleagues did some of the early work in the area of mental illness, and they've argued that structural stigma includes institutional policies that either intentionally restrict the opportunities of or yield unintended consequences for members of stigmatized groups. So one of the most prominent examples of institutional policies that promulgate stigma was Jim Crow laws in the U.S. South, which was a way of maintaining white privilege from Reconstruction through the early 60s. But more recent examples of these kinds of laws and policies include constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage and recent laws that have allowed special scrutiny of individuals suspected of being undocumented immigrants. So my colleagues and I have built upon this important initial conceptual work to conduct a series of empirical studies linking specific indicators of structural stigma to a variety of different adverse health outcomes among different stigmatized groups, with a particular focus on lesbian, gay, bisexual, or LGBT health. So I'll focus on that work today. We've used a multi-method, multi-measure approach to study these relationships. We've used a variety of different measures of structural stigma that I've listed here. And we've also used a variety of different methodological approaches, including observational, quasi-experimental, and laboratory designs. So the important point here is, of course, there are strengths and limitations to each of these methodological approaches. And so what we're looking for is triangulation or convergence of results across these different methods in order to improve the inferences that we're able to draw about these relationships between structural stigma and the health of LGBT populations. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of my talk is walk through several examples of the different kinds of methodological approaches that we've used to examine this research question. So the first methodological approach that we've used is to capitalize on the fairly substantial state-level variation in social policies that differentially target LGBT populations for social exclusion or inclusion here in the U.S. So in one example of this work that I'll present, we created an indicator of our indicator of structural stigma were 2 state-level policies. So we coded states based on whether their hate crime laws and employment non-discrimination acts specifically included sexual orientation as a protected class. And we created a dichotomous variable comparing states with no protective policies versus states with at least one of these 2 protective policies. And hopefully you'll forgive my perpetuating the red state, blue state distinction. But I've shown in red here the states with protective policies, and the states in blue are the states that had at least one of these 2 protective policies. And this is in the year 2005. We then linked this policy level data at the state level to individual level mental health outcomes from a data set called the NESARC. This is the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions. It's a nationally representative survey of non-institutionalized adults age 18 and over. You can see in the second wave it had a nice sample size of nearly 35,000 participants. And these were face-to-face interviews, and the researchers used semi-structured diagnostic interviews that were used to generate DSM-4 psychiatric diagnoses. And this data set also included a measure of sexual orientation and identity. At the time, it was the largest nationally representative study to include a measure of sexual orientation. And finally, we needed a state of residence for all the respondents. So we had all the different ingredients that we needed to examine this association between this indicator of structural stigma and sexual orientation disparities in mental health. So I'll just walk through the results here. On the y-axis are the adjusted odds ratios indicating the likelihood that LGBT respondents met criteria for a psychiatric disorder relative to heterosexuals. And on the x-axis here are the disorders where we find a significant interaction between sexual orientation and the state-level policy. So first, starting with dysthymia, for those of you who aren't in the mental health field, dysthymia is a mood disorder. By definition, it's less severe but more chronic than a major depressive episode. I sort of think of it as a Eeyore of mental health problems, sort of low-grade kind of chronic pessimism. So we find that LGBT individuals living in states with protective policies were no more likely to meet criteria for this mood disorder than were heterosexuals living in those same states. Or stated another way, the sexual orientation disparity in this mood disorder was eliminated in states with protective policies. In contrast, LGBT adults living in states with no protective policies were nearly 2.5 times more likely to meet criteria for this mood disorder than were heterosexuals in those same states. We find similar results for generalized anxiety disorder. This is an anxiety disorder that's characterized by chronic tension and worry. We find that LGBT adults living in states with protective policies are a little bit more than 1.5 times more likely to meet criteria for this anxiety disorder than are heterosexuals in those same states. But in contrast, LGBT adults living in states with no protective policies were nearly 3.5 times more likely to meet criteria for this anxiety disorder than were heterosexuals in those same states. I won't belabor the point here, but we find similar results for these other outcomes, including psychiatric comorbidity, which is the presence of 2 or more co-occurring psychiatric disorders and is an index of illness severity. One of the additional strengths of the NESARC is that it also includes a measure of perceptions of discrimination. That is the extent to which people perceive that they've been discriminated against in a variety of different contexts, like in interpersonal contexts, such as healthcare or employment because of their sexual orientation. And that's important because it enables us to address an alternative explanation for these results, namely that maybe it's just that interpersonal forms of stigma and discrimination are just more prevalent in high structural stigma states. And so therefore, structural stigma is really just an aggregate measure of interpersonal stigma and wouldn't exert an independent effect on mental health over and above stigma at the interpersonal level of analysis. So we control for interpersonal discrimination in the analyses, and our results remain robust. And so this suggests that structural forms of stigma may contribute to sexual orientation disparities in mental health over and above stigma at the interpersonal level, and that these results aren't due to an aggregation bias. At the same time, though, this approach, of course, is the weakest in terms of causal inferences. These are cross-sectional studies. And so in a second methodological approach, we've capitalized on the rapidly changing policy environment surrounding LGBT populations to conduct quasi or natural experiments to test the association between structural stigma and health. So, of course, it's unethical for me to randomly assign individuals to live in high structural stigma and low structural stigma states. I can't do a randomized experiment, even if the IRB would let me. So I can't do traditional randomized experiments, but we can take advantage of naturally occurring changes in structural forms of stigma, which usually occur through some change in a law or policy. It's been difficult to conduct these kinds of studies because you need a somewhat unique data structure. You need measures of your health outcome among a stigmatized group before the shift in the policy, and then follow the sample over time to see if health changes after the change in the policy. One of the reasons this has been difficult is because you often can't anticipate when these policy shifts occur, and so it's hard to collect baseline data, particularly in population-based studies. But we've been able to do this approach in a couple different studies. I'll just present one today for the sake of time to give you a sense of the approach we've used. So as many of you will remember, in 2004, several states passed constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage. And these occurred during the presidential elections. And it just so happened that these events occurred in between the 2 data collection periods of the NESARC, which is that data set that I mentioned from the previous study. So NESARC respondents were first interviewed in 2001, and then the same respondents were re-interviewed again 4 years later in 2005, following the passage of the same-sex marriage bans. So that provided a quasi-experiment where we could examine changes in the prevalence of psychiatric morbidity among the LGBT respondents who had been assessed both before and after the passage of the bans. For the sake of time, I'll just present the results for any mood disorders, although we find similar results for the other anxiety and substance use disorders that we examined. So on the y-axis here is the prevalence of mood disorders, and on the x-axis here, the state of residence. So on the left-hand side here were the LGBT respondents who lived in one of the states that banned same-sex marriage, and on the right-hand side here, LGBT respondents who lived in one of those states that did not ban same-sex marriage. So you can see here at wave 1, before the passage of the marriage bans, the prevalence rates for mood disorders were nearly identical between these 2 groups. However, at wave 2, following the passage of the same-sex marriage ban, there was a 37% increase in mood disorders among the LGBT respondents living in one of those states that banned same-sex marriage. And you can see from the within group adjusted odds ratios here that that's a statistically significant increase. In contrast, there was actually a 24% decrease in mood disorders among the LGBT respondents who lived in one of those states that did not ban same-sex marriage. That's not a significant decrease, although there is a trend here towards a protective effect of living in one of those states that did not ban same-sex marriage. In the next set of analyses, we were interested in seeing whether the effect of these marriage bans was specific to our stigmatized group. We would expect from stigma theory that these structural forms of stigma should be associated with adverse health outcomes among the stigmatized group, that is, among the LGBT populations, but not among heterosexuals. So to test that, we reran these results examining changes in the prevalence of psychiatric disorders among LGBT individuals and heterosexuals, both living in one of those states that ban same-sex marriage. So as I previously just showed, there was a 37% increase among the LGBT respondents living in one of those states that banned same-sex marriage. But in contrast, there was only a 3% increase in mood disorders among heterosexuals living in those same states. And as you can see, that's not a statistically significant increase. So we've shown that these results are specific to members of the stigmatized group, that is LGBT populations. All right, so moving to a third methodological approach to studying this relationship between structural stigma and health. So here we have capitalized on the large regional variation in terms of social attitudes regarding the acceptability or permissibility of homosexuality here in the U.S. So our indicator here of structural stigma isn't laws or policies, but instead is broad social and cultural norms surrounding members of our stigmatized group. So in the example that I'll present today, we were interested in whether structural stigma here operationalized as living in communities with high levels of anti-gay prejudice, whether that might be associated with increased risk for all-cause mortality among sexual minorities living in those communities. So answering this research question, again, requires a somewhat unique data structure. You need population-based data set with measures of sexual orientation and social attitudes, which is already very rare, at least here in the U.S. And then also, because our outcome is mortality, you need a longitudinal data set to follow the sample over time. And it wasn't until very recently that a data structure emerged that enabled us to begin to examine that research question. And this is a data set that's actually now publicly available. My colleague Peter Munich linked the General Social Survey to the National Death Index. So I'm sure many of you are very familiar with both of these data sets, the GSS being one of the primary sources of social indicator data since the early 70s. And they started to include measures of people's attitudes towards gays and lesbians in the late 80s. So what we did is we aggregated these individual responses about people's attitudes towards gays and lesbians up to the community level. So the innovation here is we're not asking gays and lesbians themselves about their perceptions of the level of stigma in their environment, which characterizes much of the work in this area, but instead we're asking the community residents themselves about their own attitudes towards gays and lesbians, and then aggregating those individual responses up to the community level such that each community has an average anti-gay prejudice score. And there were 170 different communities across the U.S. and the GSS that we used in the analyses. So I'm just going to show here a hypothetical example of how we created this data structure. So you can see here we're comparing two different communities that differ in terms of their level of anti-gay prejudice, with relatively low levels of prejudice in San Francisco versus relatively high levels of anti-gay prejudice in Shelby County in Tennessee. We also know the number of sexual minorities who live in those different communities because the GSS had also included a measure of sexual orientation. And then finally, as I mentioned, these data were then linked to the National Death Index, so we know the number of sexual minorities living in those communities who had died by the end of the study. We also knew among those who had died the leading cause of death based on the ICD-9 diagnostic code. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. So here are the results. These are cost proportional hazard models, given that mortality was our outcome of interest. We controlled for a variety of different risk factors, demographic risk factors at the individual level, in addition to socioeconomic indicators at both the individual and community level. And you can see that those who live in higher structural stigma communities are at increased mortality risk compared to those living, these are sexual minorities, compared to those living in low structural stigma communities. This is just another way of visualizing the data. Here on the y-axis is percent alive at the end of the study. On the x-axis is time. So by the end of the study, 92% of sexual minorities who lived in the lowest structural stigma communities were still alive at the end of the study. In contrast, only 78% of those who lived in the highest prejudice communities were still alive at the end of the study, controlling for these established risk factors for mortality. We're also able to begin to identify potential mechanisms that might explain how structural stigma is associated with increased mortality risk. And we were able to do this here by looking descriptively to see which specific causes of death were most elevated among the sexual minorities who lived in the highest prejudiced communities. And so if we find plausible causes of death that should be plausibly associated with stigma in these high stigma communities, it begins to suggest mechanisms that might explain this relationship. And interestingly, we just find 3 specific causes of death that were the most elevated in these high prejudice communities, and that was suicide, homicide and violence, and cardiovascular diseases. So again, as I mentioned, this suggests mechanisms. So for instance, cardiovascular disease being strongly patterned by psychosocial stress, suggesting a potential stress pathway linking structural stigma to health outcomes. In addition, we're able to begin to test plausible explanations for the alternative explanations for these results. So you might have been thinking up to this point, well, maybe it's just that the healthy sexual minorities are leaving the high stigma communities, which would be a rational response to living in a high prejudice environment, leaving the unhealthy LGBT respondents behind. So what looks like a social causation story is really due to social selection, in particular in selecting into low prejudice communities, and differential selection by health. That is, the healthier LGBT respondents are moving. Unfortunately, the GSS does include measured geographic mobility, and we see that health is not associated, among the sexual minority sample, health is not associated with movement. So it was not the case that the healthier sexual minorities are moving to low stigma communities. So suggesting these results are robust to selection effects regarding geographic mobility. Okay, so moving now to a fourth methodological approach that we've used. Here we've capitalized on unique population level reductions in structural stigma to test these relationships. So the research question here is, if structural stigma is a contributor to sexual orientation health disparities, we should see reductions in the size or magnitude of sexual orientation disparities following declines in structural stigma at population level. Again, to test this, you need a somewhat unique data structure in a particular social context. So with respect to the data, you need measures of your stigmatized group over time and health measures over time. But you also need those data sets to exist within a social context that has experienced fairly pronounced declines in structural stigma related to sexual orientation at a population level. So it's been very difficult to find both a data set and a social context that meet those requirements. But one place where where we've found this is in Sweden, which over the last 15 years has undergone really pronounced changes and declines in structural stigma in terms of laws and policies and attitudes surrounding LGBT populations. So I've shown here just a couple of examples of some of the changes in their laws and policies over the past 15 years or so. You can see, for example, in 1999, they added discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation to their anti-discrimination policies. In 2003, protections based on sexual orientation were added to hate crime laws, and then in 2009, same-sex marriage was legalized. And these changes in their laws and policies were reflected in changes in social attitudes in Sweden towards gays and lesbians. So just one example of this is data from their European social survey showing the percent of the Swedish population agreeing or strongly agreeing with this statement, gays and lesbians should be free to live life as they wish. And you can see an increase in those who agree or strongly disagree with this comment, such that in 2014, 92% of the general population is agreeing or strongly agreeing with this comment, compared to about 82% in 2002. So in order to examine this association between declines in structural stigma at a population level, whether through changes in laws or policies and attitudes, and sexual orientation health disparities, we used a data set called the Swedish National Public Health Survey. These, in 2005, they started including measures of sexual orientation. And these are population-based health surveys that are conducted every 5 years of the general population of Sweden. And we looked at the proportion of respondents that endorsed an LGBT identity at each of these time points and showed that the proportion is relatively stable over this period, suggesting the underlying distribution of sexual minorities is relatively stable over this period. We just started. I just got access to this data set. We've just started looking into this some newer work, and we started looking at mental health outcomes, given that that's some of the strongest outcomes that we found some of the prior work. So I'll just present those results today. So what I've shown here on this side of the axis is a standardized score of structural stigma. So we combined the laws and attitudes during each year and plotted that here, so you can just see what I just presented, which is a reduction in structural forms of stigma in terms of laws and policies and attitudes during this period. And then we've shown here the percent that are endorsing elevated psychological distress symptoms stratified by sexual orientation. So you can see here in the lightest gray is a decrease over the 10-year period in the proportion of gays and lesbians who are endorsing psychological distress. We see a slight decrease between 2005 and 2010 among bisexuals, but then an increase again in 2015, and a slight decrease in psychological distress among heterosexuals during this time period. And we tested the interaction between year and sexual orientation, which is statistically significant, indicating that the reduction in psychological distress symptoms among gays and lesbians was stronger than it was for heterosexuals. And then we also looked at the size of the sexual orientation disparity in psychological distress over this 10-year period. You can see that in 2005, gays and lesbians were nearly 3 times more likely to report elevated psychological distress symptoms compared to heterosexuals, but the disparity is no longer present in 2015. We also tested, we were also interested in identifying, again, potential mechanisms that might explain how changes in structural stigma might be contributing to changes in sexual orientation health disparities. In particular, we're interested in stigma-related mechanisms at the individual or interpersonal level. That is, do structural forms of stigma change stigma processes at the individual and interpersonal level that might in turn contribute to improvements in health. This data set that we used only included 3 stigma-related mechanisms at the individual and interpersonal level. So we conducted a multiple mediation model to test those. Those 3 factors we're testing are perceptions of discrimination, the extent to which you perceive that you've been discriminated against, victimization and threats of violence, and finally expectations of victimization. And in this model, only victimization and threats of violence mediate this relationship between structural stigma and psychological distress. We don't find support for discrimination or expectations of victimization. Taken together, these results suggest, at least in a preliminary way, that declines in structural stigma at a population level, whether through changes in laws and policies or attitudes, are associated with declines in the size of the sexual orientation disparity and psychological distress. And that's explained in part through reductions in interpersonal forms of stigma in terms of victimization and threats of violence. So the last methodological approach that I'll talk about today, is we've moved from these large-scale epidemiologic and community-based studies into the laboratory. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and so I'm interested in examining a variety of different psychological and biopsychosocial mechanisms that might explain this relationship between structural stigma and health. Of course, the advantage of, there are many limitations in laboratory design, but one of the real advantages is that you have experimental control, and so you can examine how prior exposure to structural stigma affects a variety of different behavioral, psychological, and physiological responses to the same stimulus in the lab. And so we've illustrated a variety of different mechanisms, but I'll just talk about one today, which is the stress pathway, given that some of our prior results from these observational studies have suggested stress pathways. So we, in this study that I'll present, this one study I'll present today, we're interested in this relationship between structural stigma and the HPA axis, which is important in regulating the body's stress response system. The HPA axis, of course, culminates in the production of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and that was the outcome that we examined in this lab study. So we invited 74 different LGBT young adults into the laboratory, and they had all grown up in 24 different states as adolescents, and I'll mention why that's important in just a minute. But they were told that the purpose of the study was to understand connections between your daily experiences, your bodily activity, and health. And so we're, of course, interested in structural stigma here, so we created a slightly different measure of structural stigma in this study. Instead of using single indicators or laws or attitudes, we created a composite index of the level of structural stigma in the state where our participants grew up. So I've listed here the 4 items. We included measures of the density of same-sex partner households in the state, the proportion of gay-straight alliances in public high schools in the state, a composite index of 5 state-level policies surrounding LGBT populations in the state, and then finally a composite index of state-level attitudes towards gays and lesbians. A factor analysis suggested those are loading onto this single construct of structural stigma, and so we could standardize and sum those and assign each state the level of structural stigma. So you can see here in this map I've shown lower scores, lighter blue scores indicate higher levels of structural stigma. So you can see the distribution of structural stigma across the U.S. And you can see here from the Z-scores there's quite a bit of variation across these states. So as I mentioned, we had 24, our respondents grew up in 24 different states. And our question was, where did you grow up, which state did you grow up in for the longest period of time between the ages of 10 and 18? And we asked them that because we know from the developmental literature that this is the period of time when most LGBT individuals are first reporting same-sex attractions and awareness, and also beginning to identify as LGBT, at least to themselves, even if they haven't disclosed it to others. So they might be particularly sensitive or aware of these social environments surrounding them. And then our respondents, so we assigned the score based on the state that they grew up for the longest period of time as an adolescent, and then they had all moved to New York, a low structural stigma state, where the study was conducted. And so our research question is, how does prior exposure to structural stigma as an adolescent affect physiologic stress responses in the lab as a young adult? So to answer that, our participants completed the Trier social stress test. This is one of the most well-validated stress paradigms. Some of you may be familiar with it. They're told, once they come in and acclimate, they're told that they have 5 minutes in which they're going to have to give a speech in front of 2 individuals who are trained in the evaluation of speech. And of course, unbeknownst to them, these are Confederates that we trained, and we trained them to just give neutral feedback. So they don't smile, they don't nod, they furrow their brow, they're taking notes on a clipboard. They're looking very serious, no positive affirmation. And the topic of the speech is to talk about a time in which you've been discriminated against or rejected because of your sexual orientation, to really heighten the social evaluative threat component of this identity-related task. And so, of course, they're giving this in front of 2 people that they don't know, and they don't know their attitudes towards gays and lesbians. And then following this 5-minute speech task, they then have to immediately do a 5-minute stress math test. This is, to me, the worst part, where you start, you're given a preposterously high number, and then you have to count backwards by 7s really quickly. And if you mess up, the Confederate yells at you and tells you have to start all over again. So, not surprisingly, in a meta-analysis, this lab study produced the most reliable stress response of all the different social evaluative threat tests that they studied. And so we collected neuroendocrine samples via saliva that we assayed for cortisol at 3 different time points. So here are, before I show this statistical model, just show the figure for the cortisol output on the y-axis here, and here are the 3 different time points. So this is baseline after they've come into the lab and acclimated is the first time point. Time 2 is the reactivity measure. So this is 20 minutes after the speech task begins. And then time 3 is 20 minutes, this is a recovery measure, and that's 20 minutes after the math task begins. And these are, again, timed based on this meta-analysis suggesting what we know about the peak cortisol response to social evaluative threats. And we're comparing the LGBT respondents who grew up in low structural stigma states compared to those who grew up in high structural stigma states. And you can see here a blunted cortisol response among those who grew up in the highest structural stigma states. And I'll talk about interpretation of that in just a second. But before I do that, I just want to quickly show the statistical model we control for a variety of factors that affect cortisol response. And also want to point out that we also included a measure of perceptions of stigma at the individual level. These are the types of measures that are typically used in these studies. And we controlled for that also in the model, and we're able to show that structural stigma is a correlate of HPA axis reactivity over and above stigma at individual level analysis.
Is that current, like what they're currently?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, not your perceptions of stigma from when you grow up, but current perceptions of the extent to which your group is devalued and discriminated against. So in terms of interpretations of these results, this blunted cortisol response, or the hypocortisolism that we observe, has also, among those who grew up in the highest structural stigma environments, has also been observed in numerous studies among individuals exposed to chronic life stressors. Just a couple examples here: youth exposed to childhood maltreatment, and also individuals with PTSD and other forms of trauma. There's also neurobiological research suggesting neurobiological mechanisms, explaining how chronic stress exposure might be associated with this hypocortisolism. So this work suggests, at least in a preliminary way, that growing up in these high structural stigma environments may exert biological consequences that are similar to other chronic life stressors, and begins to suggest a stress pathway potentially linking structural stigma to health. So in my talk, with just a couple thoughts about moving this work forward in terms of extending some of this research on structural stigma and health. The first is I'm really interested in exploring the generalizability of structural stigma and other stigmatized groups. As I mentioned, of course, presented today, our work is really focused on LGBT populations, but the methods and approaches and theoretical concepts that we use are certainly applicable to the study of other stigmatized groups. So just one example, I have a doctoral student who's really interested in structural forms of stigma related to gender identity. And she's just published a paper on this. Until very recently, though, it was really difficult to study that research question because there was really little, if any, variation at the state level in terms of laws and policies surrounding the transgender population. So it was in many ways, a ubiquitous exposure. Theoretically, we thought it might have mattered for health, but it was very difficult to show that because there was such little state level variation. But of course, really recently now, there's a real proliferation and changes in laws and policies at the state level related to gender identity. So I think this is a particularly interesting time to explore these relationships. But of course, there are many other stigmatized groups, ethnicity being a great example with changes in laws and policies related to immigration that I think is a sort of natural extension to some of this work. Secondly, I'm also really interested in developing new measures and indicators of structural stigma. As I presented today, most of this work is really focused on laws or social attitudes, explicit attitudes. And there are limitations to these measures. For instance, these measures of people's that targets, stigmatizers' attitudes towards individuals in stigmatized groups are subject to social desirability bias, and might then therefore underestimate the relationship of structural stigma when you aggregate those individual responses up to the community level. So, in part to address that, we've been involved in a couple different ways of trying to think through developing new indicators. One of them is I've collaborated with a former Google analyst who uses Google search terms to create indicators of attitudes towards stigmatized groups. So in this one study, he's created the indicators of Google racial epithets through search terms and aggregate that up to the community level as a sort of indicator of racial animus in a particular area. And we linked that to a health data set, showed that is associated with a variety of different adverse outcomes among African American populations. So, one of the real advantages of these Google measures is that the individuals who are using them are less likely to censor their attitudes on the internet. There are a variety, though, of limitations to this kind of measure, too. But I think trying to do this kind of approach, triangulated with other measurement approaches, such as the use of implicit measures, is another way of extending this work to think about developing new indicators of this concept. Third, I think it's really important to continue to and further this work on evaluating relationships between different forms of stigma across multiple levels of analysis. So I've talked through my talk so far as if structural and interpersonal individual forms of stigma exist in isolation, which of course is not the case, but it's been really difficult to study these interrelationships because so few population-based data sets include measures of structural stigma and stigma at individual and interpersonal levels of analysis. We've been able to do this in one study that I just want to quickly walk you through just two quick slides to give you a sense of how I think this work could be done. We used a policy index from 38 different European countries. This was an index that ranged from 0 to 100%, 100% being that the country had all 14 protective laws and policies like in terms of employment, non-discrimination, hate crimes, relationship protections, things like that. And you can see here there's quite a bit of heterogeneity across these 38 European countries, ranging from a low of 6% in Russia to a high of 82% in the UK. And then we linked this policy-level data, similar to what we've done in our other studies across 38 European countries, to individual-level outcomes among gay men who lived in those countries. And that data set included one measure of stigma at the individual level. It asked the men the extent to which they conceal their sexual orientation from others in their environment. And we find that men who live in high structural stigma compared to low structural stigma countries are significantly more likely to be concealing their identities. And again, the reason this is important is we have a lot of theoretical work, particularly in psychology, suggesting that structural forms of stigma may shape individual and interpersonal forms of stigma. But very few studies have tested that empirically, so I think that's an important gap in the literature, and this is just one example of how that work can be moved forward. And then finally, I think it's important to think about the extent to which these structural forms of stigma might be undermining the efficacy of psychological intervention. This actually isn't our own work, but a colleague of mine, Alicia Reed, did this paper for a special issue that Bruce Link and I edited in Social Science and Medicine on structural stigma and health. And I love this study, so I'm an evangelist for it. So I just want to quickly walk through what she did, because I think the findings are really important for intervention implications. So what they did is they reanalyzed a meta-analysis of 78 different individual-level HIV prevention interventions among African Americans to improve condom use. So these were psychological interventions aimed at reducing HIV incidence and prevalence. And she took advantage of the fact there were 78 different studies, and they had been conducted across the U.S. in a variety of different communities that differed in terms of the level of anti-Black prejudice in those communities. She used measures similar to what we've done in attitudes, but also she used a measure of racial and residential segregation as another indicator of structural racism. And she linked that into the data set and reanalyzed the results to see whether these structural forms of stigma were moderating intervention efficacy. I'm just presenting the results for the attitudes, but she finds similar results for the racial residential segregation as well. So on the y-axis here is the mean effect sizes, and on the x-axis here is attitudes. This is a feelings thermometer scale, so it ranges from low levels of prejudice, from high levels of prejudice to low, so 100 would be very low levels of anti-Black prejudice. So you can see here that as anti-Black prejudice in terms of attitudes decreases, the effect size for the intervention increases. In contrast, in the highest prejudice communities, the effect size for these individual level interventions was 0, whether they were not effective in the highest prejudice communities. And so I think this opens up a lot of different directions for future research in terms of understanding why our psychological interventions really flourish in some certain contexts and fail in others, and begins to suggest that structural stigma might be one mechanism that explains the heterogeneity in responses to individual level interventions. So, in conclusion, we've shown through a multi-method approach that structural stigma is one as an indicator for a variety of different adverse health outcomes among LGBT populations. And we've suggested that structural stigma might have a far-reaching health consequences ranging from maladaptive physiologic stress responses measured in the lab all the way up to premature mortality at a population level. And our work has begun to suggest potential mechanisms linking structural stigma to health. We've looked at two kind of general classes of mechanisms in terms of stress pathway and stigma processes. But we also need a lot more work to identify additional mechanisms. And one of the reasons that's important is it suggests potential targets for psychosocial interventions. Although at the same time, the study I just presented suggests that we need to be careful in terms of targeting these interventions at the individual and interpersonal level and think about how structural stigma might in turn reduce the efficacy of those interventions. And then finally, in terms of implications and applications of this work, I collaborated with several attorneys on court cases for state-based discrimination, including a same-sex marriage case in the Supreme Court last 2 summers ago now, I guess. And so this is just one example of the use of social science data to inform public policies aimed at reducing structural forms of stigma and improving the health of stigmatized groups. So I'll end there just by acknowledging the content of this work and my many wonderful collaborators involved in this work with definitely not happen. And thank you again for the invitation, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Mark.